like to welcome you this morning to this wonderful event, a conversation with Senator Bob Graham and others on the untold story of 9/11. I would like to first welcome the Senator and his wife, Adele Graham, to our club. Thank you for coming. Dan Christensen and his wife, the Senator's daughter, Mrs. Kendall Graham Elias, and grandson, Mr. Louis Robert Elias. I believe you may have met them. They've been out at the table. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I would also like to welcome the following special guests: Ms. Cindy Fields, Mr. and Mrs. Terry Flynn, Tom Jewin, Patricia Kenny and Pam Koch, Linda Oberhaus, Philip Reed, and Terry Strada. I also would like to welcome representatives from the press who are joining us this morning. I would like to thank Jenna Hansen from the Naples Daily News, Matt Ogden from the Executive Intelligence Review, and he's flown all the way from Washington, D.C. to be with us. Who have I left out? I would also like to thank the representatives who are here filming the event, or will be taking care of for an independent film on the Senator and his quest, and the other's quest for, well, I'll let you find out what their issues are. I would like to introduce you to a woman who will tell us a little bit about our speakers today. Terry Strada is the widow of Tom Strada, who was 41 years old when he was killed on September the 11th, 2001 in the North Tower on the 104th floor. Terry proudly serves on the 9/11 Families United to Bankrupt Terrorism Steering Committee and is the national co-chair of the 9/11 Families and Survivors United for Justice Against Terrorism. In this role, she lobbies in Washington, D.C. for the passage of JASTA, H.R. 3143, and S. 1535, and supports H.R. 428, which urges President Obama to release the 28 pages of the Congressional Joint Inquiry into the Intelligence Community activities. As Terry recently wrote in the Huffington Post, without money, 9/11 never would have happened, ever. It is the financiers of this horrible act of brutality against us who need to be stopped. Money is the lifeblood of terrorism. Terry, welcome.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you everyone for having me here today. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here in beautiful, sunny Naples, Florida. And I am very touched by all of the veterans here today, and thank you for your service. I was asked to introduce to you our two key speakers, the former governor and senator of Florida, Bob Graham, who is recognized for his leadership on issues ranging from education, economic development, healthcare, and environmental preservation, as well as his service on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and our second speaker, Dan Christensen, an award-winning investigative reporter for the Miami Herald and Daily Business Review. Last minute, we also are pleased to have a third member joining our panel today, First Amendment attorney from Miami, from the law firm of Hutton & Williams, Tom Jewin. He represents Dan Christensen and all of his efforts, and he will be speaking today as well. They are here to tell you the untold story of 9/11. It is both riveting and frightening, and no matter what you think you may know about that day, I promise you by the end of this program, you will learn so much more. But first, I would like to take a moment and remind you why we are here. On September 11th, 2001, 19 terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes, crashed them into our national landmarks, and attacked our country. They attacked capitalism when they crashed into both twin towers of the World Trade Center. They attacked our defense by piercing into the Pentagon. And they were aiming for our nation's capital next. They were successful in killing nearly 3,000 innocent men, women, and children on American soil. Excuse me. When the smoke cleared and the fires were extinguished, nearly 3,000 children were left grieving for the loss of their parent, including my 3 young children, who were 7, 4, and 4 days old. Countless parents, like Lorene and Matt Salito, hearts were torn apart at the loss of their adult children, many who, like their son Matthew, were just beginning their young careers. Young children flying to Disneyland never made it to their destination. Lives were shattered and we were devastated. Our dreams, our loved ones vanished from us within hours. We lost friends, colleagues, and our lives were changed forever. We must never forget, since 9/11, our country has spent over $2 trillion fighting in wars as a direct result of the attacks on our nation. Over 2,000 soldiers have lost their lives, and thousands more have returned home with severe and mental, physical injuries that will last a lifetime. To this day, over 900 rescue workers have died from their exposure to toxins they inhaled at Ground Zero. Yes, incredibly, the death toll continues to rise. 9/11 was a brutal act of terrorism. We must recognize, as long as there are well-funded radical Islamists vowing to destroy us, we will never be safe. No matter how many of their leaders we eliminate, airstrikes we launch, sanctions we execute, or boots on the ground we deploy, if we do not stop the flow of money going to the terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, we will never be safe. This is where the story of 9/11, as most of us know it, ends, and the untold story begins. It is with great pride and personal honor to introduce a hero of mine, a man who works tirelessly fighting for the truth to be told, former Senator Bob Graham.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Terry, and thank each of you for coming out on this special American Day to learn more about one of the most horrific events in our nation's history. I want to thank first the families who are here today, who have suffered and continue to suffer from this tragedy. I want to thank the first responders and the men and women of our military who continue to protect us, reducing the potential of another 9/11 and being in a position to respond should the worst occur again. I also would like to say that this Veterans Day is a special day in my family's life. My father was a captain in the U.S. Army in World War I in France and was there on November the 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. When World War I ended. In fact, my father was a lifetime teetotaler, a quality that he failed to transmit to his children. And said that the only time in his life when he had liquor in his mouth was on November the 11th of 1918 as the troops celebrated the end of that horrific war. I also wanted to draw to your attention a step towards trying to avoid the kinds of circumstances which 9/11 represents, and we will be talking about some of the untold of those circumstances. By focusing on the next generation of public and civic leaders in our state and nation. I've been proud to be part of the establishment of a Center on Citizenship at the University of Florida. And one of our objectives is to identify young people who are not going to make a life of public service, but rather who are going to pursue their own desires, but have in the back of their mind that part of that desire is to give back in public or civic service. Our objective is to motivate that desire, to give to these young people some skills that will increase the likelihood of their service being effective, and to also provide a heavy introduction to the ethics and integrity required to be a public or civic leader. We have some material about that program at the front desk. I would encourage you to take it, and I hope that there will be another opportunity we might discuss that further. But to turn to the topic of the day, there continue to be some untold stories, some unanswered questions about 9/11. Maybe the most fundamental question is, was 9/11 carried out by 19 individuals operating in isolation, who over a period of 20 months were able to take the rough outlines of a plan that had been developed by Osama bin Laden and convert it into a detailed working plan, to then practice that plan and finally to execute an extremely complex set of assignments. Let's think about those 19 people. Very few of them could speak English. Very few of them had ever been in the United States before. The two chairs of the 9/11 Commission, Tom Kane and Lee Hamilton, have said that they think it is highly improbable that those 19 people could have done what they did without some external support during the period that they were living in the United States. I strongly concur from my experience as co-chairman with Porter Goss, who used to represent this community in the House of Representatives and was the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, charged with the responsibility for conducting the congressional inquiry. If it was improbable that these people could have worked alone, where did they get their support? Well, we know quite a bit about what happened in one place, and that one place was San Diego. I have written a book called Intelligence Matters, which describes in detail what we know about San Diego. But briefly, we know that there was an individual who had been declared by the FBI prior to 9/11 as being an agent some wise person has decided that it is more important that we take a rest and eat lunch. Then we will prepare what happened in San Diego? Come back after.
I hope that you all enjoyed your lunch. I want to thank our staff and our chef, Chris Jones, for providing us with this wonderful luncheon today. But I would like to especially But I am especially anxious to return to our program and to resume the comments that Senator Graham began earlier before our luncheon. So please direct your attention to the front table.
Thank you very much. As I was saying before the salmon, the answer to the question of was it
feasible that these people could have carried out such a complex event without any external support. We know something about this beyond just what your intuitive feeling is, that it was unlikely that people so limited in language and cultural awareness in the United States could have accomplished this. But we also have some harder facts. Briefly, the San Diego story is that there was a man by the name of Omar Bayoumi, a bookkeeper by training, who had been assigned by the Saudi government to live in Southern California to oversee Saudi students, of which there were quite a large number, to determine if there was any evidence that they were plotting against the kingdom. The Saudi royalty had been very shaken by what happened in Iran, where a group of younger people, college-age Iranians, had largely led the overthrow of the Shah, and they were fearful that something similar was going to happen to them, and so they wanted to have monitors around the world. Bayoumi was one of those. In a mid-January day, Bayoumi, with a driver, went from San Diego to Los Angeles, where he spent an hour at the Saudi consulate with the director of religious affairs, a position which had been established in most of the Saudi embassies and consulates around the world to build a relationship between the Saudi government and religious leaders, primarily to promote their own form of Islam, which is known as Wahhabism. While there, by alleged coincidence, Bayoumi ends up at a Middle Eastern restaurant where he is sitting in the vicinity of two young men who are speaking Arabic with a Saudi accent. He invites them to join their table, and in the course of the conversation encourages them to come to San Diego, saying that if they do, he will provide them with significant assistance. They accepted his offer, came to San Diego, and he delivered on his commitment by providing them with an apartment which he paid the initial rental upon, a circle of friends, and suspiciously significant amounts of living money. This gentleman, Bayoumi, had taken a ghost job with a Saudi company based in San Diego, for which he got paid but was never expected to show up to work. And as soon as the two hijackers arrived, his payments went up substantially. His wife also began receiving direct payments from the Saudi embassy in Washington. The assumption is, although the facts are not available, that he was receiving these monies as a conduit to the two that he had invited to San Diego, who would, on September the 11th, both be in the plane that flew into the Pentagon. Those are, in cursory form, some of the things that we know about the relationship between two hijackers and a support network in San Diego. 10 years later, we began to learn something about a similar relationship between hijackers and Saudi citizens in a place not far from here in Sarasota. The person who probably knows more about this than anyone on earth is Dan Christensen. Dan is a former investigative reporter for the Miami Herald, and now with the Broward, soon-to-be Florida Bulldog, a blog investigative site. Dan has been investigating the Sarasota issue since September of 2011, the 10th anniversary of this tragedy. And I'd like to turn the microphone over to Dan to have him give you some background as to what we know about the Saudis in Sarasota.
Thank you, Bob. Again, since you don't know me, everybody knows him, Dan Christensen. I operate a news organization based in Fort Lauderdale called Broward Bulldog. Broward's the name of the county. We are a 501c3, and our board of directors recently voted to change our name to the Florida Bulldog. And as soon as we can get the website changed, which is easier said than done, it'll look like the Florida Bulldog. But you can get there by going to browardbulldog.org. And we're celebrating our 5th anniversary this year. I got a quick story here. I've been a reporter in South Florida for 30 years plus, and I got laid off by the Miami Herald in 2009. Decided that instead of selling shoes or something, that I would start a website and report basically watchdog news. I named it Broward. Actually, my wife named it Broward Bulldog because I wanted to initially focus on local stuff, but inexorably, with the story about 9/11 and other things, we seem to be writing about statewide issues. So we decided to change the name. Anyway, we are having since we are a 501c3, we exist on contributions, and we're having our 5th anniversary fundraiser in Fort Lauderdale on November 18th. If anybody's going to be there at that time, you're certainly welcome to come. And we operate on a fairly modest budget, and so if anybody here checks us out, likes what we're doing, if you could help us out, see clear to help us out, we would very much appreciate it. Anyway, let me begin by saying that there is one person who is not here who is crucial to all of this. His name is Anthony Summers. He's an author, a longtime friend of mine. He and his wife wrote a book called The 11th Day. It's a great account of what happened that day. Very readable story. He's also an investigative journalist, so it was more than simply a recounting of the events that day. Anyway, that book was published in the summer of 2011, and later went on the next year to be a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History, of all things. Anyway, he calls me. I've known Tony for many, many years, and he called me right as the book was being published to say that he had gotten a tip about something that they hadn't had time to include in the book, but they wanted to follow up on, and was I interested in helping out? And I said, yeah. And basically, the tip was about an FBI investigation of a Saudi family that had abruptly moved out of their home in an upscale residence, not actually technically within the boundaries of Sarasota, but just immediately south in a development called Prestancia. Some very lovely homes there. They left, basically abandoned their home about 2 weeks before 9/11. The neighbors started getting suspicious after September 11th, called the authorities, and law enforcement led by the FBI here later discovered that the home had been visited by vehicles driven by the hijackers, including Mohammed Atta, who was the guy at the controls of the plane that slammed into the North Tower. They found this out because it was a gated community. There were license tags, photographs of license tags of cars that went in and out of the place. There were also log books and all this stuff. It was all confiscated by the FBI. Phone records were subpoenaed, and there were connections found. They used a thing called link analysis to determine, which tracks, looks at the length of the call, the dates and times of calls, to make connections, and they found connections to the hijackers as well. Anyway, if you recall, some of the hijackers, including Atta, were located in Venice, where they were taking flight training. And Venice is about 10 miles from this house, 10 miles south of this house. So we hear all this stuff, and we went to Senator Graham because he was the head of Congress's, or the co-head of Congress's, co-chair of Congress's joint inquiry into 9/11. And when we went to him, we were expecting him to, we were going to ask him about this, and we were expecting him to tell us something about this, or say that he couldn't talk about it because it was classified. But we got a very unexpected answer, and that unexpected answer was, he didn't know what we were talking about. And from there, frankly, it took me a couple of minutes to just absorb that fact, and we started digging in further. The thing that struck me about it in our conversation when we had that day was that you had said to us that you felt that this information had opened a new door into the investigation of 9/11, that it was that significant here. We contacted the Department of Justice before we ran the story. They declined to comment. The FBI, a couple of days later, confirmed that there had been an investigation, which was a significant thing because Senator Graham's committee hadn't even been told it was an investigation. By the way, this also didn't appear anywhere in the 9/11 Commission report. So they would not tell us, though, while denying that there was anything to this, they wouldn't tell us the basis for that. They wouldn't say, well, we found this and this and this. They just said there was no connection and we're supposed to take that on faith. So I guess I should explain how all this began. It began with two things. It began with neighbors calling the FBI shortly after 9/11. It began with a guy named Larry Berberick, who was the administrator, head of security, and a resident at Constancia. He was also a top aide to the sheriff. As a matter of fact, he had been in Sarasota. If you recall, President Bush was in Sarasota visiting an elementary school, among other things, the day the terrorist struck, and Larry was there with him that day. Anyway, after talking with him, he confirmed what we had been hearing from a source a law enforcement source that Tony Summers had spoken with. And we found out that the names of these Saudis were Abdul Aziz Al-Hiji and his wife Anud Al-Hiji. And it was Anud's father who owned the home. His name was Issam Ghazawi, and he was an advisor to Prince Fahd, who was a member of the Saudi royal family, which perked up our ears when we heard that. Anyway, our principal law enforcement source on this, had told us that prior to 9/11, both Mr. Ghazawi and Mr. Al-Hiji were on a watch list that was put out by a U.S. agency. For some reason, wouldn't tell us the agency, but an agency that tracks terrorist funds. We also learned other information. We spoke with an attorney here actually in Sarasota, who had been contacted by the FBI. He represented the Homeowners Association, which had sued the Al-Hijis, trying to get their dues and stuff that they were owed. And the FBI called this attorney, and they tried to get him to, in essence, lure Mr. Ghazawi, the owner of the home, back to Florida, where they could talk to him. The guy was willing to do it, but Ghazawi never showed up. So he ended up executing the documents that he needed to execute at the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon. Anyway, so we write this story. The Miami Herald ran it, purchased it, and ran it the same day that we did, and it became a pretty big deal for a week or two. And so we resolved that we wanted to try and get more information. So we began filing Freedom of Information Act requests with the Justice Department and the FBI. And they kept telling us that they had nothing that was what they referred to as responsive to our request, meaning that they had no documents that we should see. But we also filed a public records request with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement using the state public records law. And we wanted to get information about this Al-Hiji guy. And what we received after several months, it was in early 2012, was what amounted to the first written documentation of all this. Prior to this, we had been writing stories based on things that people were telling us. Now we began to see actual paperwork on this. And it contained some significant new information. It turned out that there was a guy named Wissam Hammoud who was classified as an international terrorist associate by the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, where he's currently doing 21 years for weapons violations and trying to kill a federal agent and a witness against him in this weapons case. He lived in Sarasota, and he had ties to Palestine's Islamic Jihad. Anyway, on the documents that we got show that on April 7th, 2004, while he was awaiting trial, actually I think he was making his plea, he was interviewed by both an FBI agent and a Sarasota County Sheriff's deputy who was assigned to the local terrorism task force. And he told them about, they asked him a number of things, and one of the things he told them about was Al-Hiji and his friendship with the guy. And he had said that Al-Hiji had considered bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, a hero, that was his word. And he also had, based upon a variety of things, he also had suspected that this Al-Hiji guy knew some of the hijackers. To me, more significantly, he also said that, personally, that this Al-Hiji guy had introduced him once prior to 9/11 with a guy named Adnan El-Shukrajuma, who is a former Broward resident, who currently is wanted by the FBI as an Al-Qaeda leader. He's got a $5 million bounty on his head, has, for the last 10 or 12 years. And, he said that this Al-Hiji fellow had introduced him to the guy. So I got in touch with Hammoud via email. There's ways that you can do that, even though he's in prison. And he confirmed that he had said all these things to the FBI years earlier. And he, gave us some additional information, some of which we managed to verify and some we couldn't. But in the meantime, Tony Summers, who lives in Ireland, by the way, and that's why he's not here today, we had taken the information that we knew, and he had managed to track this Al-Hiji guy down. Al-Hiji and his family had left the country back in, when they left their home. They'd driven up to, or flown up to Washington. And then within a few days, I believe it was, they had gotten a flight to Saudi Arabia. Anyway, we had gotten some information that he lived in London, which turned out he did. He was working for the giant Saudi oil firm, Aramco, in somewhat of a flunky type job, nothing special. And Tony and he hooked up with some guys he knew at the Daily Telegraph in London, and they staked out this guy, finally managed to get him. We got a picture of him, and the guy from the Telegraph managed to get a phone interview with him, in which he denied any involvement in all this, said that this, 9/11 was a terrible tragedy, but wasn't willing to really explain in detail what it was that he knew, how he knew, Shukrajuma, or if he knew Shukrajuma, those sorts of things. So, in 2013, rolls around. Well, actually, towards the end of 2012, we didn't get anywhere with our FOIA requests, so we filed a lawsuit. And Tom Julian will talk about that. He's represents us in court. He's a fine First Amendment attorney from Miami. Anyway, so we filed suit in September 2012. 6 months after that, very unexpectedly, I received a package, a small package from the FBI. And remember, they had been consistently telling us that they had nothing to release. All of a sudden, they released 35 pages. I think 4 or 5 of those pages were completely blanked out. The rest were heavily censored. But there was enough in there to show what amounted to what I consider to be a bombshell. and that was that the Sarasota Saudis who had fled their home 2 weeks before 9/11, and they used the word fled, had, quote, many connections, unquote, to, quote, individuals connected with the terrorist attacks on 9/11/2001, which was a very specific thing to say. This was completely the opposite of the FBI's public position on this, and it raised many new questions here about the Saudis' role and whether or not we've been told the truth about it to date. I remember talking with Tom about this, and he was telling me how unusual it was that they released this information after saying they had nothing. All of a sudden they're releasing information, and there's this, very telltale remark in it. I still don't know what to make of that as to why they did that, but we were speculating on there might be somebody sympathetic to getting the story out, and who knows. Anyway, the key document here was dated April 16th, 2002. Remember, these are all FBI documents. And it's posted on our website at browardbulldog.org. If you go back and you find the story, all this stuff's there. We've got, we put up quite a bit of this stuff that you can see for yourself. Anyway, it listed 3 individuals who were involved in the attack and tied them to the same flight school where Atta and Marwan al-Shehhi, who was the guy who flew into the second tower, trained. Of course, their names were blanked out and any information about them. And what was most interesting about that was the government was now citing reasons of national security for blanking that information out. Again, it left me scratching my head as to what's going on. Anyway, this was the first time that the government asserted national security regarding this whole thing. Prior to that, they talked, they said, well, we might have found some stuff, but there were privacy considerations of the individuals involved, even though they weren't U.S. citizens and they didn't live in the United States. But they previously said there was nothing to all this. So this was in April or March of 2013. A few months later, in June 2013, the FBI files court papers seeking to basically put an end to our FOIA lawsuit, saying that certain classified information about the Al-Hijis, quote, would reveal current specific targets of the FBI's national security investigations. Given that no explanation here was given as to why the investigation that supposedly found nothing, involved information so secret that its disclosure would cause, quote, serious damage to national security, this disclosure served only to deepen the mystery, as far as I was concerned. Senator Graham's concerns about all this, and we, were speaking with him throughout this whole thing, led him to give a 14-page sworn declaration in our FOIA case, in which he essentially accused the FBI of impeding Congress's joint inquiry into this. I mean, that's an extremely serious charge, I think. It also prompted the 9/11 Families United to Bankrupt Terrorism Group to call on the FBI to come clean about its Sarasota investigation. It wasn't long after that the courts reinstated the 9/11 Families lawsuit against Saudi Arabia here. And then this year is finally when we began to see court action in our Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. In April, we filed this in Fort Lauderdale. The judge there, Williams Locke, who's a U.S. District Court judge, ordered and very conservative kind, we were kind of surprised by this, but he ordered the FBI to conduct a more thorough search of its files. His orders cited inconsistencies and nonsensical legal arguments by the government in making their case to withhold information from us, and said that basically said they failed to satisfy the requirements of the Freedom of Information Act to withhold this information. Again, sort of an amazing turn of events, I thought. There have been a few more pages that have sort of dribbled out here from the FBI since then, including 2 that talked about a chilling find in a dumpster in Bradenton on Halloween in 2001, which would be like, a month and a half after the attacks. And it was, according to the very brief information that's in this document, there was stuff that was put in this dumpster. It was put there by a man with a passport, and it included a, quote, self-printed manual on terrorism and jihad, a map of the inside of an unnamed airport, a rudimentary last will and testament, and information from the Flight Training Center in Venice, and maps of public shopping centers in the Tampa Bay area. Yeah, spooky. Ultimately, Judge Zlock ordered the FBI to turn over to him for his private inspection more than 80,000 pages from its Tampa office for virtually everything that they produced about 9/11 in the Tampa office is before the judge to determine whether or not it can be released to the public. Now, I don't think that all of this information pertains to what happened in Sarasota, but I do think that there's going to be a good chunk of that pertains to Sarasota. And I wanted Tom to talk a little bit about, tell you what the status of that is, and also talk about, we have a parallel action ongoing that's not a lawsuit, but is a legal action, and it's called, the process is called a mandatory declassification review, which I'd never heard of before. It takes a lawyer to find this stuff, and he did. And essentially, it's an alternative to the Freedom of Information Act. A lot of times it's used by historians, as I understand it, try and go back and get documents from many years ago and open them up. And you initially have to go to the FBI, they blew us off, the Justice Department blew us off, and now it's at a different foreign interagency panel. And I'll let Tom talk about this because he knows it a lot better than I do.
Well, thank you very much, Dan and Senator. They say that all politics are local, and certainly all journalism, I think, is local as well. And this really is a good demonstration of that, because the national press has not really been reporting this story. This has been our boots on the ground, Dan Christensen, talking to people, interviewing people, visiting people in person, and trying to find out just what exactly happened here. And it is really quite a remarkable thing that occurred. And I think, when Dan was first starting to work on this story, the FBI was, I think, quite clearly upset that there was information that was coming out, in part because this information had not been disclosed to Senator Graham, notwithstanding the Joint Inquiry's efforts to gather all the information they could about what the law enforcement agencies around the country were doing. They had not disclosed what they had done in Sarasota, and in part because Dan was now reporting about this, and there was something they knew about this that was not supposed to come out. And when his story first came out in the Miami Herald and on his website, the Broward Bulldog, the immediate reaction of the FBI was, I think, to try to discredit the reporting. The FBI's public spokesperson in Tampa came out with a press release that was not given to Dan directly, but to other reporters, that said that, look, yes, there was an investigation, but we found nothing. We found no connections between this family that had mysteriously disappeared shortly before 9/11 and the terrorist attacks. I mean, it was just absolutely unequivocal, and it looked like it did discredit what Dan had reported. It looked like they were trying to, I think, make it look like he had it absolutely wrong, that there was some significance to what had occurred here. And it was really then Senator Graham who worked with Dan to look at this further, because when the FBI said they found nothing, they also said, oh, and by the way, everything we did find, we reported to Congress. And Senator Graham told Dan, well, if they did, I didn't see it. I didn't know anything about it. I'm from Florida, and I would have noticed something that was occurring in Sarasota that involved an FBI investigation of potential terrorists. And so Senator Graham really helped with his own investigation and started to get somewhere with the FBI internally to let us know that the FBI, in fact, had done an investigation, had that confirmed at fairly high levels of the FBI, and they showed him some of the documents reflecting that, that there had been an investigation. And that's what gave us what we needed to go into court and to say, we know there are documents. Dan had made a Freedom of Information request, and they had come back and said, there's nothing that we are finding here. We're not going to search for the names of the families that you're giving us because that would invade their privacy. But we went into court and we said, we know that if they did an investigation and they found nothing, there should be some records that showed that. And Senator Graham gave us a declaration that he had seen documents. And that's when after we filed the lawsuit, we went to the U.S. Attorney's Office and we said, there must be some records that would show what you did. And they said, no, there's nothing. You're barking up the wrong tree. There's absolutely nothing here. We said, well, we're going to file a declaration, a sworn declaration from a former United States Senator who conducted this investigation. It's going to say he's seen these FBI documents. And that's when they decided to release the 35 pages that directly contradicted their public statement that had attempted to discredit Dan's reporting. That document, as Dan said we found that there were many connections, not no connections, but we found many connections between this family and the terrorists who attacked on 9/11. We've tried to work with them. We've tried to say, look, you know, if there's really something to this, where there's a national security implication here, help us to understand what that is, and maybe we will back off of this. We're not trying to destroy the United States. We're not trying to harm the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. If there's something you can tell us, they've told us nothing. And that's when we went to Judge Locke and we said, look, you know, they've given us 35 pages, and 35 pages show many connections. There must be more. We don't think that they would have just dropped this thing. And Judge Locke, who, as Dan said, is a very conservative federal judge in Fort Lauderdale, he said he was very troubled that the FBI did not seem to be forthcoming in explaining what it was doing, and he ordered this subsequent search. And the initial reaction to the search was, well, look, you know, we can't do this search. It's too difficult. And he ordered them to do it. He ordered them to look for documents in the Tampa field office that showed the case number for the Pent Bomb investigation, the attacks on the Pentagon and the Twin Towers in New York. That was the code name. And he said, look in the Tampa field office to see if there are any documents there that have that code name. And they came back and they said, we found 80,000 pages of documents with that. And we said, well, what's that about? You know, and they said, well, we can't tell you, that's all classified. And that's when Judge Locke said, I would like to see every single page of those documents. And he's been conducting a review of those documents since June. He's given us no indication of what he has found. The FBI said they wouldn't give them all to him at once because he did not have a big enough vault to hold all the documents. And so they gave him a special vault that would take 4,000 pages of documents at a time, and they've been rotating the documents in. So we don't know what's going to happen with that. But we have Judge Locke on the case, and he's conducting some sort of a personal review. So we're hopeful that that is going to result in the release of many more documents. On the other front, and that the Sarasota investigation is really what Senator Graham's committee did not know. This was information they did not get from the law enforcement agencies. They were trying to get and didn't get it. The 28 pages is what they did get, and that the FBI had classified, and that's preventing the release of that. And the process that Dan's talked about is this very arcane process. It's part of a presidential executive order that allows any citizen to seek declassification of documents that have been found to be potentially harmful to the national security interests and classified. And we went in and we said, now it's A decade later, these documents were classified way back in 2001, 2002. There's now very strong reasons to declassify. The 9/11 victims' families need these documents to try to show that Saudi Arabia should be held responsible for the terrorist attacks. And we went through that process. The FBI did not even respond to the request for declassification, although they're required by regulation to do that. The Justice Department did not respond within the time they were allowed to address this. And that's when we have appealed now to this panel that is an advisory panel to the President. And we've been told by their staff that they expect this panel that has representatives from the State Department, from the Justice Department, from the Director of National Intelligence, and from the Department of the Archives, that panel will come up with a recommendation to President Obama as to whether they will recommend declassification of the 28 pages of Senator Graham's report. This is a completely different process than what's happening in Congress. We could have a decision any day, but what we've been told is that sometime during the winter there will be a recommendation that will go to the President on whether to declassify this. And as you know, and as Dan has reported, and Senator Graham's indicated, there's so many congressmen have said declassification will not harm the national security interest. It will help national security for the public to know what was Saudi Arabia's role, what they found out at the time. And so we're somewhat hopeful that that panel will take our appeal seriously. It's an appeal by Dan Christensen and Anthony Summers and a co-author, Robin Swan, that are all seeking that declassification decision. So we should have something soon. That's the status.
Thank you, Dan and Tom. Let me just wrap up with a few other of the untold stories. In addition to what we know in Sarasota, what we know even more in San Diego, there were other places where hijackers spent significant amounts of time, such as Patterson, New Jersey, Falls Church, Virginia, and Palm Beach County, Florida. We have been trying to find out, were there investigations similar to what we know took place in Sarasota in those three areas, and if so, what result? We have run into exactly the same stone wall, even on the question of, did they investigate an area such as Palm Beach County, where Atta and the leadership of the hijackers lived for an extended period of time. It's unbelievable that there was an investigation, but it's equally unbelievable that the FBI won't even say yay or nay that there was such an investigation. So there are gaps of factual knowledge about what happened, which would, I think, open additional windows. Then there are some speculative questions. Why would Saudi Arabia have done this? I mean, they've been an ally of the United States since World War II. We entered into an agreement between the first king of Saudi Arabia, King Saud, and Franklin Roosevelt, that during the Second World War we would defend Saudi Arabia if it were attacked, and they would assure us a reliable source of petroleum. And that agreement is still in place. We have the nuclear shield applies to Saudi Arabia. If someone were to attack Saudi Arabia tomorrow with a nuclear weapon, we would be obligated to go to nuclear war against that attacking party. So why would they allow their persons in the United States to serve as the support network for 19 hijackers? I'm not sure that they knew what they were doing, but I think I have a pretty good idea of why they did what they did. Much of this story goes back at least to the first Persian Gulf War, the 1990-1991 war. At the end of that, the Saudis were shaken. They
realized that but for the intervention of the United States, they would have been invaded by Saddam Hussein and probably would have been quickly vanquished by Saddam Hussein. So they became concerned about their own security. I mentioned that one of their concerns was, are there young people in Saudi Arabia who are plotting against us? And they set up this system of monitors to watch over young people. They also were concerned that their own military was so inadequate. And so they started to enter into agreements with other countries in addition to the United States, particularly the UK, for enhancement of their military. Much of this is written in a nonfiction book that I wrote and was published in 2004 called Intelligence Matters. This nonfiction book was fairly heavily censored, and that, as the author, was like having them pick it through your children and decide which ones were going to be dismissed. After I retired from the Senate, I spent a year at the Kennedy School, and one of the faculty members there is a man named Joe Nye. Some of you may be familiar with Professor Nye. He's the person who is the author of the phrase peaceful warfare, the use of non-military terms of activity. He said, I had the same experience. I had served as an assistant secretary in the Department of Defense. I wanted to write a book about my experiences, and when I realized how much would be censored, I shifted, and instead of writing a nonfiction book, I wrote a novel where I could tell the same story, but since it was not being presented as being factual, it was not subject to censorship. Well, the bell went off in my head that maybe the way that I could tell the untold stories was by writing a novel. And this great piece of fiction called Keys to the Kingdom was the result of that. I say that Intelligence Matters ask the questions, and this gives some of the answers. And the answer to why the Saudis did what they did, what I strongly believe they did what they did, was because after that Persian Gulf War, bin Laden, who had been fighting the Russians in Afghanistan, came back to Saudi Arabia, accompanied by 30,000 war-hardened Mujahideen, and said to the kingdom that if they did not support bin Laden's global aspirations, that they would start civil insurrection inside Saudi Arabia, and it was clear that they had the capability of doing that. And one of the early assignments, once the kingdom had agreed to assist bin Laden, was to turn over to him this network of monitors that had been developed so that they could serve as the front line of assistance to his hijacks. I'm not saying that the Saudi kingdom knew the details of what the people that bin Laden was going to place the United States had as their mission, but they were sage enough to understand that it probably wasn't something that was going to be beneficial to the United States. The hardest unknown question to me is, why has the United States, over now some 14 years, been so soft on the Saudis? Why have we allowed them to go without public awareness of their complicity? It was easier to answer that question, frankly, during the Bush administration, because, among other things, the Bush family had a long association with the House of Saud, going back to Prescott Bush, as well as the fact that there was this relationship between defense and oil
between the United States and Saudi Arabia. What is the more difficult thing, and I say this as a Democrat, is why has the Obama administration continued this soft treatment of Saudi Arabia? My speculation is that they have felt that the Middle East is so fractured, fractious, and violent at this time that Saudi Arabia would be a source of stability in a very otherwise shaking region of the world. I personally completely disagree with that assessment. What is the current issue that the Congress may be voting within the next few days to authorize war against, and several $billion of your tax money to pursue, and that is ISIS. This is a very interesting book by a British journalist who has the reputation of being the most knowledgeable journalist on matters in the Middle East, Patrick Cockburn. And his assessment is that ISIS is just the latest ramification of Saudi Arabia's efforts to export this very extreme form of Islam known as Wahhabism. And that the failure of the United States to publicly disclose what Saudi Arabia has done in the past has been taken as a signal to the kingdom that they have impunity. They can do virtually anything they want to, and there won't be any reaction, at least from the United States. And the consequence of that immunity has been that Saudi Arabia essentially established Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was a product of 20 very wealthy families in Saudi Arabia. And 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. It has received most of its financing from Saudi Arabia. And ISIS fits almost exactly the same pattern. It is the child of Saudi Arabia and continues to be substantially supported financially, militarily, by Saudi Arabia. I personally think that the national security of the United States will be served when we let the American people know what happened, and I think there will be a public reaction that will cause the United States to no longer give to Saudi the impunity that we have in the past. So in addition to the reasons that the American people deserve to have the historic record set right, and the families who suffered so much deserve to have justice, and they will get justice when the facts of the Saudi involvement are known, and our own long-term national security, all argue for dispelling some of these unknowns and unanswered questions and untold stories. Let the American people know what happened, and then let the American people be involved in shaping what our future towards justice and our own security should be. So I thank you very much. Now, I've been told that this is a very compliant and quiet audience, and that what I'm about to ask will probably meet with no response, and not to take it personally. But does anybody have a question? Yes, sir. For the benefit of those of us who are new to the community, would you mind giving us your name, sir?
My name is Michael Bailey, and I'm much encouraged by your comments starting here. But at any rate, I'm much encouraged by your, the Commodore says I can be heard. by your comments concerning the current and previous administrations. You sound like a true American. But my question is, can you help us understand why some people who financed the 9/11 incursion here, and ISIS among others, who own Twitter and 25% of Citibank, can be allowed to have these numerous financial investments here in the United States? Can the government do anything to stop this?
I guess the answer is yes, the government,
Within the constitutional constraints of freedom of press and freedom of speech, there are things that the government could do. I guess the question is, would it be wise to do? Tom, you've made your career as a First Amendment attorney. What would be your comment?
Trying to stop those investments, there's certainly serious due process concerns. Obviously, the families of the 9/11 victims are trying to establish responsibility for the 9/11 attacks. But these things have not been established. These are issues of fact. The Saudis have denied any responsibility. The Saudis, in fact, have said that they would like the 28 pages to be released because they believe that that would show that they are not culpable in the attack. So there is a serious mystery here that remains to be solved. Certainly, before the United States government can start doing anything like appropriating Saudi assets in the United States or stopping Saudis from investing in U.S. interests.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm an airline pilot, and I've always wondered, I can't believe that there were 4 attempted hijackings and 4 successful hijackings. Has there been any work study done where they show that other attempts were made and maybe not successful? Either the planes never took off or they landed quickly. Were there only 19 hijackers and they were all successful at doing what they did?
To my knowledge, there has been no evidence that there were more than the 19 hijackers, nor more than the 4 aircraft that were hijacked.
There are 20 hijackers, but Musawi, who is in prison, right?
Yeah, there are several candidates for that 20th hijacker, the one who wasn't on the plane that went down in Pennsylvania, that had he been there might have changed the outcome of that attack. Musawi is one. There was a man, which I talk about in Intelligence Matters, who came through the Orlando airport, and a very alert customs person noticed that he had a one-way ticket from Saudi Arabia to Orlando and no apparent means of paying for a return trip. And he prevented that individual from entering the United States, and he was flown at our expense back to Saudi Arabia. Which one of those 2 or someone else was in fact intended to be the 20th hijacker we could add as another unknown. Yes, sir.
The scandal is the free press. How come New York Times, Washington Post never has published any of this? How is this possible?
Well, we have a journalist among us, and we're going to let him answer that question.
I didn't exactly catch it all. Could you repeat it again?
This is a scandal. Wait a minute. Where's the New York Times?
Oh. Gotcha.
Where's the New York Times? Where?
I understand the question now.
New York Times, Los Angeles Post,
Right.
Post. How come this was never published? I mean, None of us knew about this.
Right. Well, the Miami Herald did publish it. They published it, we sold it to them, they ran it the same day. It was a big splash on the front page. And they have, we've written, if you go to to our website, the stories are still all there. If you just do a search for 9/11 or Bob Graham, you'll find a lot of these stories there. The Miami Herald has run a bunch of those. The Sarasota Herald Tribune has run, but you're correct, there's nothing. I believe that the Daily News New York and the New York Post might have written a little bit about this, but the papers, the big papers in Washington, the Post, the New York Times have not done this, and they know about this because I've spoken. I mean, I've been a reporter a long time. I've got a friend who works at I got a couple of friends who work at the New York Times, and I have not been able to get an answer. One of them has expressed interest a couple of months ago, so I'm waiting to hear from him. But nothing yet, and I don't know. I've covered a lot of big stories in my time. This is the most important story I think I've ever done. And why it hasn't, I was expecting it to be picked up immediately. Why it hasn't been, I simply don't know the answer. I mean, Senator Graham's family owned the Washington Post until not long ago, and he couldn't get the story there either. Can anybody explain that to me? I don't know.
We families have submitted several op-eds, usually right around the anniversary, thinking that that would be the time that they would run our story, and it gets denied.
Right. Right, and obviously there's a recurring anniversary at which it would be timely to report all this again.
I'm logged on Huffington Post.
What's the reason? I mean, frankly, it's negligence. Journalism negligence, as far as I'm concerned.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm Nancy Bates. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'd be very interested in knowing your opinions about what might be in trouble with secret documents. However, my question is, do you think that as our country develops, hopefully, total energy independence, and that's the direction that I believe we're headed, do you think that would expedite the revelation of some of these secret documents, because we can cut our relationship energy-wise ourselves?
To the second question, the answer is yes. I believe that as we become less dependent on Saudi Arabia, as that agreement that we entered into 60 plus years ago becomes less relevant to U.S. interest, that will reduce the degree of influence that the Saudis will have in allowing them to do things without disclosure. And you asked about what was in the documents. My wife, Adele, who is with us, has received a commitment that next to our marriage vows is the most significant, and that is that I will not do anything to be taken to Leavenworth or some other place of federal recluse. So I can't talk about the details, but I can say the general theme of the 28 pages is who financed 9/11. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What is your opinion of the waterboarding activities, and were they helpful to the intelligence community?
We want to take that.
My two courageous colleagues have said they'll let me answer that question. One, I might say that there was an effort made once waterboarding and other advanced interrogation techniques, as they were called, became public, to try to throw a broader net around who knew about it and therefore had some responsibility for the use of those. I was in that net as the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. I asked the CIA, when were we briefed on the subject of waterboarding or other techniques? And the CIA gave me 4 days. Since 1977, I have carried a little spiral notebook. And among other things, I write down a log of what I do throughout the day. So I contacted the University of Florida Library, which has 3,700 of these things crowding their shelves, for the notebooks that coincided with the 4 days that briefings were supposed to be held. I determined that on 3 of the 4 days there were no briefings held. On 1 day there was a briefing, but you're not allowed to write down the substance of what is discussed in a classified hearing, but you can write down the time, the place, and the persons in attendance at the meeting. And I noticed that there were several people who did not have a classification clearance who were in the meeting, which led me to assume that it was unlikely that something as sensitive as waterboarding would have been discussed under those circumstances. When I presented these 4 books to the CIA, they concurred in their assessment, and I was taken off the list of people who had been identified as being knowledgeable about this. Now, as to your question, we have a provision in the United States Constitution that prohibits torture. And the reason was that our colonial forefathers were subjected to torture, and they knew from their own personal experience how unreliable information was that was gathered from that source, and they wanted to assure that that technique, which had been used against them by George III, was not used in the new United States of America. And I think our founding fathers were right 230 years ago, and it continues to be a right assessment of human nature. So I personally have never seen any evidence that would indicate that the information that we secured through advanced interrogation served to increase the security of the United States by providing us with reliable information. Yeah. Oh, okay. I didn't recognize you, Dan, but I'll go ahead.
And we've talked about this before, but why?
Can't hear you.
Why would the FBI be involved in a cover-up of what happened in Sarasota? Why would they lie to us initially? Why would they not tell the 9/11 Commission? Because Bob has talked to members there, I have as well, they didn't know about this. Why would they not talk about this? Why would they hide it?
Well, I think the FBI has been the most obvious and recurrent agency that has withheld information. I don't think this came from the FBI. I believe that this had its origins in the White House, which instructed all of the agencies that had information that would implicate Saudi Arabia to withhold it. And we've seen the same pattern from the CIA, the National Security Administration, the Department of Justice, as we have from the FBI. So I think the premise of your question, which inferred that the FBI had singularly decided to be complicit, they were just one of the entities that were directed to be complicit.
That was under President Bush.
And I think that's the question. Why under Obama, who ran for election in large part to change many of the policies that the Bush administration had instituted. Why, in office, had they continued those policies?
One more question.
Right here.
We were very hopeful, and President Obama did tell his family members on 2 occasions that he would release the 28 pages, but he didn't keep the promise. So I'm not answering your question, I'm just letting you know that he has done that.
And those of you who thought that the negative political ads ended last Tuesday, they continue.
One more question.
We'll take one more question, okay? Yes, sir.
Senator, my question is a little different topic, and that is the Veterans Administration. As a Vietnam veteran, it just makes my blood boil when I see what is happening, how the veterans are being treated. And furthermore, the fact that the government agencies allows the unions to create a situation where they can't be fired. The worst that happens, it seems like, is they're put on administrative leave and they continue to draw pay. Now, you and I both know in private enterprise, this would never, ever happen. So what can be done about this? Thank you.
Can I ask you a question, sir?
Yes, sir.
3 or 4 months ago, after the big scandal that started in Phoenix, there were a number of reforms made to the VA which were intended to make access more available to veterans. Have you experienced the VA in the last 4 months, and have you seen any changes in their activities?
No, I haven't experienced it in the last 4 months, but I had an episode with cancer 13 years ago and went to the VA in St. Louis, where I'm originally from, and they said it'd take 90 days to even get an appointment. So as a member of the American Legion here, a lot of these veterans are still having problems. And as a matter of fact, I heard this morning on the news that this new Veterans Administration head fella still has not fired anyone, not one person. And there's still a bunch of them on administrative leave drawing pay. I just think it's almost criminal what is happening.
Well, I'll answer your question, but I also will make you even madder by saying this issue of people being held accountable for their actions was one of the major things that our congressional inquiry explored, including making a number of recommendations for dismissal of persons in the FBI and the CIA and other agencies whose performance before and after 9/11 was unacceptable. 0 of those recommendations have in fact been carried out. So it isn't just the VA that's reluctant to have a system that sanctions bad behavior and rewards superior behavior. What I think the VA needs to do, and I was on the VA committee for 18 years, so I had an opportunity to see it fairly closely over an extended period of time, is the whole concept of a government bureaucracy outside the mainstream of the American medical community, being the only channel through which veterans can get their health care, is an idea that is out of date and out of time. What we ought to be doing is going to more of a voucher-like system where veterans can go to the health care system that is available to everybody else, and they can choose which physician they have confidence in to have their needs met.
So thank you. I totally agree with you, and I wish you a lot of success.
Well, I've retired, so somebody else is going to have to do that.
We have one more thing that we would like to present to you, our audience today. I would like to introduce one of our members, Lorraine Salido, who is in fact responsible for bringing the Senator and Dan and Tom here today. Thank you, Lorraine, but I would also like to call you up to the microphone. Lorraine, as you will see on your bio sheet, lost her son on 9/11. And since then, she has been very, very active in the Family Steering Committee. She is part of the Family Survivors United Against Terrorism and the 9/11 Commission, which she served. Lorraine.
We know that this is a heavy subject for all of us. I thank you for being here. I thank our speakers for coming. Those of us that work here, first of all, on 9/11, we lost 2,979 people. And there are that many families, and I want you to be all sure that you understand that those of us that are here never speak for all the families. The families that are here, we're a group of about 20 steering committee members, and we have dedicated ourselves to look at legislation in a nonpartisan way that hopefully will help this country and will make sure that this does not happen to any other family. So that really is our mission, and I really want to make sure that you understand that. I also wanted to leave you with a feeling of hope. The 9/11 community is not just the families. It consists of the survivors, the first responders, the volunteers, and the residents that were displaced from their homes, some of them for up to 2 years, especially down in Battery Park. We're going to end with what is very appropriate today for being at the Naval Sailing and Yacht Club. It is a video about the volunteers of 9/11 that many people don't know. It is called Boat Lift, and while it may bring a tear to you, I want you to just see how strong this country is. People like club members Erica and Peter Aaron actually sent their boats and their rafts in the evacuation process. So be proud as you see this, and thank you again for coming.
So I also want to point out something you may not have noticed yet. Hanging on our back wall is the flag of honor, which was brought here today by member Lorraine Salido. On that flag are the names of every victim who died in the 2001 attack. So take a moment and just reflect and ask yourselves, what can you do to keep this from happening again? Thank you. Senator Graham is signing his book outside. Please, if you would like to purchase a copy of his book, if you would like to speak with Dan and Tom separately, they are here and ready to answer your questions. Thank you very much again for coming today.
Good luck.